First, a word about the Field and Garden Podcast. The Field and Garden Podcast is a part of the Gardener's Workshop. The Gardener's Workshop has been telling the stories and how-tos of growing, selling, and helping others to pursue their flower-growing dreams for over 25 years. What began as one gardening enthusiast sharing her passion has grown into so much more. Over at thegardenersworkshop.com, find in print with our blogs and books and through our podcasts and videos and courses, and we have a shop full of the same tools, seeds, and supplies that you hear mentioned on our podcast. You can connect with all of these resources over at thegardenersworkshop.com. I hope you'll take some time to explore all we have for you. Welcome to the Field and Garden Podcast.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Ask the Flower Farmer Live. I'm not Lisa Mason-Ziegler, I'm Dave Dowling, filling in for Lisa today. I want to welcome everybody who's listening in. So let's go ahead and get started on the questions for today. I see one here so far, a couple of them. What is the best fertilizer for peonies? That's Luis Lagermat is asking that. A well-balanced fertilizer is fine, like a 10-10-10 or 5-5-5, but it's when you fertilize the peonies is what matters. You want to do it in early spring before they start to sprout, and then again in mid-summer when they're making their new eyes for next year's flowers. And it's also very important to water the peonies in the summer. The next question is about a heat wave. In a heat wave or a drought, you want to make sure you water everything, but especially your peonies in July and August, because that's when they're making their eyes for next year. And if they're struggling, lost in the weeds, without any water in the middle of a drought, you're not going to have as many good peonies the following year. And then Renee in 1949 wants to know, should I fertilize during a heat wave? Only if you need to fertilize and haven't fertilized yet. In other words, plants need food or fertilizer from when they're planted until you harvest. So if you haven't fertilized at all, yes, go ahead and fertilize them, but make sure you water that fertilizer in really well. And but if you have been giving them fertilizer and there's really lots of nutrition in the soil when you planted, you don't need to fertilize in the middle of a heat wave. So I would only fertilize right now if the plants really need it and haven't had any yet. Okay, another question here. How do you suggest planting peonies in zone 8A, black plastic? The problem with black plastic in zone 8A, it's going to warm the soil up earlier in the season and keep it warmer later in the fall, and even sometimes warmer over the winter, because zone 8A can have sunny days in the 50s and that soil could warm up, and that's going to possibly prevent your peonies from getting enough natural cooling. So I really don't necessarily recommend black fabric for peonies in zone 8A. A wood type mulch or something lighter color would be better, or just a real thick layer of good compost, something that's not going to heat up the soil. And also in zone 8 for peonies is you want to plant them on a north facing slope if you do have hills on your farm. You don't want them facing a southern slope where the sun is shining more directly on that during the day. So a north-facing slope will help keep the soil cooler. Blair Farms of Northwest Florida. How would you treat powdery mildew in dahlias? First thing is you're always going to get powdery mildew in dahlias later in the summer, usually not till August or early September, but you want to use a fungicide. Any kind of fungicide should work. You're not going to cure any powdery mildew that is already on the plant. In other words, all you're going to do is keep it from spreading. You can use an oil spray like neem or horticulture oil. You can use a copper-based fungicide or any other fungicide for plants. But again, you're not going to cure what's already there. You can keep it from spreading and getting worse. That's why it's really important to scout your plants, whether it's the dahlias or peonies, whatever you're growing, and at the very first sign of any powdery mildew disease, to treat it right away before it spreads and gets worse. Colleen says that 2 of my peonies look like they're wilting. Am I giving them too much water or not enough? Ask your question again and let me know how long those peonies have been there. Are the new ones planted last fall or this spring, or are they established that are 4 or 5 years old? So ask that question again, and I'll give you the right answer. Jeannie wants to know what are my top 3 perennials to plant for foliage. Mountain mint, which you want to get the variety that's called Muticum, M-U-T-I-C-U-M, Muticum mountain mint. Any of the smoke bush are great, and also the 9-bark. Those are 3 great perennials for foliage, although the 2 of them aren't perennials, they're woodies. Let's go back a second. Perennials for foliage. The mountain mint, also just regular old spearmint is great. It can get a little invasive, but that just means you have more stems to cut. Just the traditional spearmint with the big leaf that's a little crinkly, nice green. You can use it before it flowers. You can even use it once it has flowers on it. So a true spearmint. And another perennial would be the baptisia. The foliage in baptisia is great. Okay, back to the question about the peonies that are wilted. She planted them this spring. Most likely you're not overwatering them. They probably haven't had a chance to grow good feeder roots. They're still just the big chunky, what I like to call carrot roots, the big thick roots. They don't have many feeder roots yet that can really take up the moisture. My recommendation was give them some shade. Even that means just putting some chairs out there and hanging a blanket over top of them to get the hot sun off of them. Just make sure they're all watered, but don't drown them, but also don't let them dry out. But peonies planted in the spring can struggle the first year because it takes them a while to grow some of those feeder roots. And without those, they can't really take up much water. So do your best to give them some shade, and I think you'll see a big difference. EWF Farm wants to know what can you use to turn over beds that you're planting sunflowers in. I'm not sure you're an existing bed and you're putting sunflowers in it now. If you're going from another crop that's finished and then putting in sunflowers, if you're doing transplants, often you don't have to do anything but just smash down or mow down the existing plants, the dead celotias or whatever you might have, and just plant the sunflowers between the existing plants, and the sunflowers will grow up and be fine over that. If you're talking about after sunflowers, you have the big chunky roots, sometimes the best thing to do is actually pull up the sunflower roots and get them out of there because they're kind of big as far as decomposing. Go ahead and put them in your compost pile. But if you're trying to plant sunflowers back into a bed that's finished with something else, usually you can just plant them between the existing plants that are finished, but you want to kill down or mow off the old plants that are finished blooming. Cynthia wants to start a cut flower garden with a bunch of dahlias. They're coming up so good. Any suggestions with dahlias with the do's and don'ts? My biggest do is make sure you keep them watered. Once the dahlias are knee-high, they need a lot of water. It's not unusual to water them 2 or 3 or 4 times a week if you have good draining soil. If your soil is more in the clay range and holds water better, maybe not quite as much, but they never want to dry out once they're knee-high. Watch for insects. One that really gets dahlias often in the heat of the summer are spider mites, and most people don't realize that it's spider mites. They see some speckly stuff on the leaves and they look a little curled and distorted, but there's usually spider mites underneath the leaf and on the new growth tips, so watch for spider mites. If you have rainy weather, spider mites are usually not a problem because the rain washes them away. It's the long, hot, dry days of summer that spider mites love. And then later in the season, you'll probably end up getting some powdery mildew, usually late August and September. And again, like I mentioned earlier, just treat for powdery mildew as soon as you see it. Another good reminder with dahlias is when you harvest them, cut tall stems, even when that means you're taking 2 side buds and trashing those. Because by cutting tall stems, it grows back with more tall stems. If you cut a really short 6 or 8 inch stem and leave those little side shoots that are right at the base of that 6-inch stem, they're going to grow to be 6 inches. If you cut down farther to an 18-inch stem, those lower ones will grow tall again. So cut deep on your dahlias, and the same thing works for zinnias. Cut low on the plant and they grow back even taller. I'm going to remind everybody, I know in the eastern part of the U.S. right now today, it's 99 degrees here in Delaware. I'm sure it's hotter than that in Texas and everywhere else. Make sure you're watering your plants. Watering should be your top priority right now, other than maybe picking and selling. Make sure your plants are watered, because a wilted dead plant, or a wilted plant, you can't harvest it because it won't hydrate. And a dead plant, you've lost everything. So make sure that you water your gardens. Very important. Somebody did ask a question, are there any varieties of peony that grow in zone 9? Any recommendations for other heat-tolerant flowers? The intersectional or eye-toe peonies are a little more heat tolerant. There is a website called southernpeony.com, or it might be southernpeonies.com, I can't remember which. It does give a lot of information about growing peonies in warmer zones and which ones have worked for this grower and which one haven't. They also sell peonies, but I wouldn't recommend buying from them necessarily because they're more of a retail price. Although if you're not sure if peonies will work on your farm, it might be a good place to buy 1 or 2 plants and try them for a year or two before you invest in a whole bunch of them. But yes, Southern Peony or southernpeonies.com. Somebody's asking the best cover crop to get nutrients back in the soil. Anything that's a legume, anything in the pea family, and also buckwheat I think is really good for that. Okay, EWF Farm was saying they're trying to repeatedly plant sunflowers in the same bed. Should be adding any amendments. This is a good place for me to remind everybody you should try your best to rotate your crops. You don't want to plant the same thing over and over year after year in the same bed because that just increases the incidence or the chance of diseases like powdery mildew, insects, and other problems with the plants. So you should always rotate your plants. If you think of the big, huge grain farmers, they don't plant corn every year. They do corn, wheat, soybeans, something different every year so that helps eliminate and reduce insects and disease pressure. So if you're trying to plant sunflowers in the same bed, amendments, you probably don't really need anything. The sunflowers, for the most part, don't want a lot of fertilizer. If you're on maybe your second or third planting in the same bed, you might put a really mild fertilizer solution on them. As far as planting, what I would do is just cut the existing ones down to the ground and plant between those for the next planting. That we don't have to do much tilling or any work at all. And then Cynthia with the dahlias wanted to know, do I pinch the tops of the dahlias off? The answer is yes and no. It's up to you. Some people pinch their dahlias and a lot of growers don't. I know some growers that keep them cut back, usually the first or second week of July. They cut them down to about 12 inches because they're not trying to get dahlias in July and August in the heat of the summer when there's really bad bug pressure from both Japanese beetles and cucumber beetles. And by cutting them way back in early July, they get a nice good flush of great stems for September and October until frost. If you don't pinch, that's fine. Just when you do harvest, again, cut that really nice tall stem so you get nice tall rebloom. EWF Farm says, I mentioned watering is necessary to top water as well as drip. No, as long as you got good drip and it's dripping deep down. Sometimes you put the drip on, you see it went 6 inches on each side, but you want to make sure it's going down deep also. If you have sandy soil, it's going down. If you have clay soil, it could just be going horizontal. So it doesn't hurt to every once in a while just dig down 6 inches to make sure it's getting down to the root zone. As far as top watering, the only ones I might top water occasionally if it's never raining and it's in the middle of a drought would be the dahlias to help eliminate the spider mites. Here's a good question from Bloom Fusion, North Carolina. How often and when do you fertilize dahlias? Well, you want to get them fertilized soon after planting. It's also really important to have fertility in the soil, basically waiting for the plants to be planted. You should always do a soil test at least once a year so you can see what nutrients you need. Sometimes you don't need phosphorus, you might not need potassium, but you need nitrogen and something else. And the other thing I like to say about plants that you're going to expect to keep producing, reblooming plants like dahlias, some celotias you're going to recut, zinnias you're going to be cutting throughout the summer, blue horizon ageratum, is you need to fertilize them again throughout the season because basically the roots might grow to a 12-inch circle and they've eaten all the food that's on that plate or it's in that soil. So you need to get some more fertilizer within reach of their roots so they can keep producing those great long stems and great flowers for you for the rest of the season up until frost. So anything that you're harvesting more than once, I like to see you fertilize them at least once a month and use a good fertilizer that has high numbers in the 10 or 12 range, like 10, 10, 10. Or if it's a lower thing, like an organic fish emulsion that's like 2, 1, 2, you just need to do it more often because you're not putting much in every time you put it in. Stringerstead Farm in Georgia with part shade and full sun areas. I want to start some perennials this year for cut flower sales. What flower varieties do you recommend? Well, if you've got my online class, they're all listed in there, but I'll tell you a few of them. For in the shade, a couple must-haves that you want to get is Astilbe, which blooms early in the season about the same time as peonies. Polygonatum or Solomon seal, which is makes a tall stem which has green leaves or green with a white variegated edge. It does get a small white flower at the base of each leaf, but that's not where you grow it. You do not grow it for the flowers. You grow it for the foliage. If anybody knows who leases Ellen Frost at Local Color Flowers in Baltimore, that is one of her favorite, if not her favorite, cut flower foliage to use. And when it's available from her grower, she buys it every week. Also like to remind people that florists, when they buy from a local farm or from the wholesaler or wherever they're buying their flowers and supplies are from, they're buying anywhere from 30 to 40% of the money they spend is not on cut flowers, but it's on cut greens to fill that vase before the flowers go in. So you should always be growing some greens and foliage or the small little flowers like feverfew that act as a filler, foliage type filler. Other perennials for a sun area most definitely would be Baptisia. There's any of the colors are great. There used to be just a blue. Now there's mauve and yellow and white, all different colors. There's a series from Proven Winners. I'm drawing a blank right now on the actual name of it, but it's Proven Winners Baptisia. There's some other breeders that have them. Baptisia, you can't get wrong. They're great flowers, great foliage all season. So definitely grow some Baptisia for full sun. The other full sun plant is Sedum Autumn Joy, because you can sell it green in July, in flower in August, and even when the flowers are starting to age in September, it's still good. Another plant for the shade would be hellebores. There's lots of new varieties that are doubles and really interesting colors. There's one series called Wedding Party, and one is Bridal Party, I think. Two different names to do with weddings. Wedding Party and Bridal Party, I think it is. And there's also Ice and Roses. Those are all three different series of hellebore that are great to grow. Urban Wildflower Company wants to know, when can you start harvesting mountain mint? She has 1-year-old plants. They should be ready to harvest now. You can even harvest them before you start getting that muted gray color bracts at the top of the plant, and as the little round floret of flowers or flower of florets starts to open, you can harvest it then. You can even harvest it before the flowers are showing. Just make sure you hydrate them before you try to sell them. What I like to say on things like mountain mint, that sometimes they have trouble hydrating, or there's the hibiscus mahogany splendor, is always harvest it the evening before you want to use it or sell it. Let them sit overnight in the cooler or in an air-conditioned room. The next morning, throw away those 5 stems that are bad. The other 100 stems in the bucket are fine. So you never want to use the mountain mint or the things that wilt easily right out of the field into an arrangement, because that one stem that goes bad makes the whole bouquet look bad. But the other thing with mountain mint, sometimes the flower can get a little dirty looking as the little teeny white florets start to age. Usually you can just brush those with your hand and brush them right off the top and they'll be fine. Bloom Fusion, North Carolina knows what's the best time to plant baptisms. I love spell check. I know she meant Baptisia. In the spring as bare root or liners. Both are available. The bare root will put up a few flowers the first year. You might be able to harvest them. They're a little bit on the small side. The bare root is more expensive than the liners. The liners planted at the same time. Next year the plants will be almost the same size, and you get flowers off of both the second year. One other warning with the Baptisia is it's very difficult to ever transplant. It gets a root system that's this really big woody mass. So really think hard about where you want to put them, because you're not going to move them in the future. You're not going to be able to move them in the future. And a really good supplier for Baptisia is Walter's Gardens. They're out of Michigan. They sell both bare root and liners, and the liner is basically a rooted cutting. They sell the Proven Winner varieties and some other varieties that aren't patented. If you do buy a Proven Winner variety of Baptisia or any Proven Winner perennial, you're required to purchase their branded pot, which they want you to plant in the pot when you're selling it at a garden center or a nursery. But there's an exemption for cut flower growers who will be planting the Baptisia directly in the field. You just need to make sure that you contact your supplier and tell them that you're a cut flower grower and have them remove the Proven Winner pots from your order. The pots are sometimes $1 a plant or $1 a pot, almost as much as the plant. So if you order Walter's Gardens, you can order those through Ball Seed or Ball Color Link, and just let them know you're a cut flower grower. You'll be planting the Baptisia or any other perennial that's a Proven Winner, that you're planting them in the field for cut flower use, and they can get the pots taken off your order. There is a short little form you fill out just saying you're going to do that. But it's definitely worth it to do it if you're planting them out in the field, because you don't want to pay for 100 pots that you're never going to be able to use. Let's get growing New Jersey. She's read that sunflowers are allopathic, I can't say it, allopathic. What can I plant next to them, or should I not interplant with them? I have never heard that from sunflowers, that they prevent other plants from growing around them. I know in the field, these weeds always did fine around them. Maybe certain weeds didn't, but I've always seen weeds growing in the sunflowers. I'm not sure of anything you should or should not interplant with them because of them being allopathic. It's the first time I've ever heard that about sunflowers. So I don't see any more questions right now, so I'm going to one more time say make sure you're watering your plants. Like I said, it's 99 degrees today in Delaware and up and down the East Coast. Plants are stressed. They need water, especially if you have a little bit of breeze that dries the plants out even more. You still need to harvest your flowers when they're ready. That means you're going to go out and harvest at sunrise, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. That's part of farming. But then you should be finished by 11 or 12 and inside cooling off or soaking in the swimming pool or head to the beach. But leave the drip tape running when you're in the pool or you're heading to the beach or taking the afternoon off. I like to say the drip tape should be running somewhere on your farm pretty much 24 hours a day when it's 99 degrees out and in the middle of a heat wave. And also looks like we're starting to get a drought here in Delaware. It hasn't rained for a while and no rain in the next week. Okay, so I guess if there's no more questions, it's about 3:30. We'll call it a day, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future sometimes.